In this lecture, I'm going to try to explain the American Revolution to you. And I'm less interested in talking about the immediate causes of the American Revolution, the things that happened in the few years before the Revolution, than I am in trying to set up a background for you of why Americans thought the way they did. Because I think that's the secret to understanding the Revolution. The British government wasn't horribly oppressive between the end of the French and Indian War and the beginning of the American Revolution. The American people didn't suffer under horrible conditions. The taxes didn't become overbearing. So why is there a revolution? And I think to answer that question properly, you have to look at the way people thought. So we're going to look at the way they thought about politics and the way they understood politics in some detail before we actually talk about events. So the first thing we're going to do today is talk about a theory of opposition, the way people in the Anglo-American, the transatlantic Anglo-American world understood power and political opposition. And we're going to start out with a prime minister and his opponents, Robert Walpole, and think about where that led people later on in the 18th century. Then, once we've talked about how people thought, we can start to talk about the actual events that lead toward the American Revolution between 1763 and 1775. And we'll look at that in terms of what the British government thought about America and what to do about the American problem after 1763. And then we'll look at the Stamp Act, because I think the Stamp Act is the most crucial element in the build-up toward the Revolution, 10 years before the Revolution actually breaks out. Then we'll look at the way Americans and Parliament differed about what they thought the role of Parliament should be in America. And then finally we'll look at taxes again and how that leads to the Revolution itself. I want to end today with a discussion again of the way people thought, because that is the crucial thing. And all of this, by the way, goes back to our discussions earlier of how governments in the colonies were used to running their own affairs, and to what I said about the Great Awakening and the way it made Americans undermine their belief in, it undermined Americans' belief in authority. Terms today. The Tea Act. The Tea Act is one of the crucial acts of Parliament leading to the American Revolution. It's an attempt to regulate the tea industry, which is a worldwide industry. Americans are drinking tea from India, so tea is a crucial element in the economic life of the British Empire, and the English are attempting to regulate this trade in a rational fashion. The Americans understand the Tea Act very, very differently. So that will get us again to this question of mentality and how Americans and Parliament interpret what's going on in very, very different ways. Robinocracy is a term that the opponents of Sir Robert Walpole, that's where they get the Robin from Robert, so Robert Walpole's opponent termed his prime ministership. And it's the critique of Robinocracy that leads to a kind of generalized critique of power and its applications that's very important when it comes to the American Revolution. Stamp Act was a tax law that the British government tried to apply to the Americans in 1765 with terrible results, and we'll look at that in some detail. Virtual and actual representation. There are two different ways that the Americans and the Parliament in particular understood the nature of government. Who do you represent? If you're a sitting officer in the legislature, and what are your duties toward those people? And those are very, very crucial questions and key to the revolution. Bill Scott, we're actually not going to use today. Okay, themes today. The American Revolution had a strong ideological component, and that's what I mean by the way people thought. And you're going to get this throughout the lecture. And that this ideological component to the American Revolution was British. It was drawn largely from British political thought. There are some other influences, but I think the overwhelming influence is British. And secondly, the cause of the revolution may have been even simpler than that, and that's what we're going to end with. A very, very simple explanation for the American Revolution. All right, so now we're going to talk about Sir Robert Walpole and his enemies and what they came up with to oppose him. There's Sir Robert Walpole, and you can see he's Prime Minister of Britain from 1721 to 1742. Big, good long run as a top politician. Sir Robert Walpole is the first Prime Minister, and that has to do with dynastic politics in Britain. After the death of Queen Anne, the next in line for the throne had to be a Protestant, and it turns out that she didn't have many very close relatives. She died childless, for example. There was no nephew handy waiting in the wings. So they had to look far afield for the next King of England, and they found them in Germany. So the king after the death of Queen Anne was George I, and George I was a German. He did not speak English, and he knew nothing about Britain, or certainly knew nothing about governing it. But nevertheless, he becomes king, and he arrives in London really not knowing at all how the system works, hardly being able to communicate with anyone. And that's where Sir Robert Walpole comes in. Sir Robert Walpole steps into the gap and is the guy that allows the government to keep working. He's one of the king's ministers. He's the most able politician. He becomes the leading minister, and in effect turns that into an office. And Walpole runs the government for the next 21 years. The way in which he runs the government becomes the issue for his opponents, or at least the issue they talk about. And that's what Robinocracy is, this attack on the rule of Sir Robert Walpole. What do the opponents of government say? Well, they come up with a critique of the way he does things. So maybe I need to talk about the way he does things a little bit. Walpole uses some devices that are kind of accidents in the development of English history. One is the use of what becomes called by his opponents as rotten boroughs. Parliament's an ancient institution. By 1721, it's hundreds of years old, and the representation in Parliament is ancient as well, and has some strange idiosyncrasies, among which are places that elect representatives where there's almost no one there, where there may be as few as, say, 50 voters. The voting eligibility is very restricted too. So there's a very, very few people who actually vote, and furthermore, almost all of those people will be in the employ of or tenants of one great landowner. So in effect, there are parts of Britain in which representation of Parliament is appointed by single people. Walpole makes excellent use of these rotten boroughs to pack the Parliament with membership that he knows will absolutely support him, because they're absolutely dependent upon the Crown's support to be in office at all. So he gets a bunch of sure votes that way. The other thing he does is make liberal use of ancient offices. There are all sorts of ancient medieval titles and jobs that no longer apply, where you may be keeper of the royal pig or something, and there's no royal pig anymore, but there's still a job and a title and a payment, which is the important thing. And Walpole, instead of just using those different offices, for people's cousins and so forth, Walpole begins to bribe members of Parliament. Look, if you vote with me, I'm going to give you this job where you don't have to do any work, you'll get lots of prestige, and you'll be paid. And the use of this this device of giving these jobs out assures him all sorts of vote in Parliament. His opponents are enraged by all of this, and they call what he does corrupt, and arguably they're right. So they develop a theory of politics about, they say, this is what's really going on. Robert Walpole is using corruption to get what he wants and to rule England. And over time, that argument doesn't go away, it outlasts Robert Walpole, and it develops into a kind of critique about government. They begin to say, the opponents of the government begin to say that what's at stake here is power, and that's what Walpole wants. Furthermore, they develop an idea that power has a kind of life of its own, that power is always seeking to grow. And if power grows, it's always going to grow at the expense of liberty. So it's the opposition between power and liberty that they say is the essential struggle in government. Power is evil, it seeks to expand, and it is corrupting. Furthermore, they say the means through which power grows is corruption. Robert Walpole being the example of that. That the powerful, once they're powerful enough, will just do what they want. They'll send the army to your door and haul you away if you oppose them. But there's a period in which people will rise up against that. And during that time, the way power and the powerful seek to attain more power is through the means of corruption. Furthermore, they say that the opposition to power to the preservation of liberty is achieved through virtue. And what they mean by virtue is that public spiritedness that puts the public good above self-interest. Whatever it is inside you that makes you refuse to take a bribe, that makes you die for your country in battle. That is virtue. That's the essence of virtue. And the only way to stop the corruption of the evil Robert Walpole's is through the virtuous good citizenship of the people in opposition. That's the essence of what they say about politics. And like I said, it outlasts Sir Robert Walpole. It becomes a kind of key element in Anglo-American thought. And it's still with us. You sit around in any kind of political discussion, and there's always going to be somebody who's talking about conspiracy and corruption of the powerful, and just think of any discussions about the president or the past president. Everybody who's in opposition to them sees corruption and lying and underhandedness, and you really can't talk them out of that. That goes all the way back to Sir Robert Walpole, that mentality. Now, what's that have to do with the American Revolution? Well, I'm going to quote to you Sam Adams speaking to the Boston town meeting in the 1760s. He says, "Such is the depravity of mankind, that ambition and lust for power above the law are predominant passions in the breasts of most men. In all nations, the worst passions of the human heart have combined with the worst projects of the human mind in league against the liberties of mankind." So there you have it in a nutshell. human beings are depraved and sinful. It's good Calvinism, right? And the ambition and lust for power are great dangers to the rest of the liberties of everybody else. In fact, he calls them projects against the liberties of mankind. So to preserve our liberties, we must resist the powerful. That's the lesson of Sir Robert Walpole, that 50 years later, people in Massachusetts and Virginia and everywhere else in the colonies are beginning to apply to fighting against the crown. Okay, now we're ready to talk about how we get to an American Revolution. So, let's start with the end of the French and Indian War in 1763. In 1763, the French and Indian War has been won, but it's cost the crown a lot of money to win. And I spoke to you when we talked about the French and Indian War about how Americans are reluctant to fight it. They want the army to fight for them. They have this overwhelming advantage against the French, but your average farmer has no desire to go marching around in the woods looking for Indians to fight and possibly be killed by. So they let the army do it, and armies are expensive. And at the end of the French and Indian War, the government has spent a lot of money. They've gained control over North America. They've kicked the French out. That's great. That's fabulous. But they're not getting any revenue from North America. And they're certainly not getting revenue enough to offset the enormous costs of this war. So the government decides, hey, we're supposed to be making money from our colonies. Colonies exist for us to become more prosperous, and this one's costing us money. It's completely wrong. So we have to start having North America pay for itself. It's only fair. They've benefited greatly from our support and our government and our army, and they got to start paying for it. And the process toward the American Revolution starts right there. The government decides it needs more money from North America, and it's going to have to raise taxes to start to pay for it. That leads us to the Sugar Act in 1764. I'm going to skip this slide, actually, and talk about, in fact, skip ahead to the Sugar Act. Here we go. The Sugar Act is a way to begin to solve this problem, create more revenue, and also to begin, the intention is at first, to end corruption in government, at least in colonial government. So let's talk about what the situation is and why it needs to change. Sugar is, as we talked about in the very first lecture, a product of the Columbian Exchange, and it's something that people very quickly become dependent on them. Think of all the sugar you use in your life, in coffee and in sweets and candy, and as a sweetener in different, food. Sugar is really ubiquitous. In fact, it's a problem for many of us. We consume too much of it. And sugar has to be imported into North America. It's something we don't grow in North America on our own, except in the Louisiana Delta, I think. It's part of the trade of the empire, and it's therefore taxable. And that's been the case forever. As long as there have been English colonies, there's been sugar that's been imported into them, and they've been subject to taxation. The problem was that nobody paid those taxes, that sugar was routinely smuggled into the North American colonies. And the way that was done was that government officials, customs officials, were bribed. And this practice was so common, it had been going on for 100 years by the 1760s, and it was so common that there were kind of standard bribe charges. You knew what you had to pay, and the system, was routine. The government sets out to change that. So they do a couple of things. The reason people were avoiding sugar taxes in the first place is because they were too high. So the Sugar Act says, look, we're going to enforce the collection of a sugar tax, but we are going to lower the tax. We're going to have a fair tax, but we're going to enforce it fairly as well. And from the perspective of the government, it's as simple as that. Revenue from taxes will go up, people will pay less, but they'll pay uniformly and fairly, and that's what a tax should be. So the sugar tax Sugar Act in 1764 comes right at the end of the French and Indian War. It's to pay for the French and Indian War. It's going to straighten out the system, this corrupt system of customs duties that's been really gotten bad, and it's going to raise revenue for the government, and it's going to be fair. So from the government's point of view, it's a big reform. Americans don't see it that way. Here's a cartoon of the royal family. That's King George III and his wife, who are enjoying their tea and are benefiting at the expense of the American colonies. Americans oppose the Sugar Act, and they oppose the Sugar Act for the reasons that people get upset about taxes now. They don't want to pay more taxes, and that's very simple. But it's the Stamp Act in 1765 that really causes a problem. Okay, this is the Stamp Act, and let's skip to a stamp. The Stamp Act is another simple tax, and from the point of view of Parliament, it's a terrific idea. Here's what it is. Stamp Act is a tax that requires a government stamp that you have to pay for on any piece of paper that passes through the government hands. So marriage licenses, real estate transactions, newspapers imported from Britain, in fact all newspapers, legal documents, trading documents in a port, anything paper that they can figure out a way to charge you for, they do. You got to get an official stamp or it's not legal, and you have to pay for the stamp. But here's the genius of the Stamp Act. The prices of the stamps are really low. It's just, pennies on the dollar. So the great thing about the stamp tax and why politicians love it is that it's a huge revenue booster. It brings in all kinds of money because it's covers such a vast thing. But people don't really notice it after a while. It's like paying gasoline taxes. We may grumble about it, but we all buy gas. We all pay taxes on every gallon of gas, and it's kind of routine, and you don't notice it. A low tax that everybody pays on a universally used good is a fantastic tax as far as politicians go, because they raise enormous amounts of money, but people don't really notice them and get tremendously upset, like they do about income tax, say. Furthermore, there'd been a stamp tax in Britain already. It had worked wonderfly. People in England paid it all the time, routinely. All Parliament is doing is extending what had been a tax in England to a tax in the colonies as well, and helping to pay for the cost of the French and Indian War. However, the Stamp Act is greatly opposed in America. People are very, very upset about the Stamp Act. Now, why? The difference between the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act is fairly simple, but also very crucial. The Sugar Act taxed trade between colonies, between the colonies of the Caribbean and the colonies of North America. That's where the sugar is transported. everybody agrees that Parliament has the right to regulate trade between colonies of the empire. They may not like the tax, but they agree that Parliament has the right to do it. Americans say that the Stamp Act, however, is not a tax between colonies, but it's a tax that's enacted within colonies. You could go to be in Boston and buy a newspaper, and you still have to pay the stamp tax. It doesn't have anything to do with, trade between colonies. You get married, you still have to pay the stamp tax. You buy some real estate, you still have to pay the stamp tax. So it's not a tax between colonies, it's a tax within ordinary life, within the colony that you're in. And Americans say that Parliament doesn't have the right to do that. That Parliament regulates the empire, but the colonial legislatures raise taxes within the colonies. So Parliament doesn't have a right to pass a Stamp Act. And the first Congress, the first meeting of representatives from the different colonies, in other words, in the United States, in what becomes the United States, in the North American colonies, is about the Stamp Act, and it becomes known as the Stamp Act Congress, and it meets in 1765. And I'm going to read to you a little bit from the Stamp Act Congress. The first thing they do is talk about how loyal they are to the king. The members of this Congress, sincerely devoted with the warmest sentiments of affection and duty to His Majesty's person and government. And then they go on about how loyal they are for quite some time. And then they talk about their objections. Actually, the first one is an objection. These are the resolutions. One, that His Majesty's subjects in these colonies, that is, people in North America, owe the same allegiance to the Crown of Great Britain that is owing from His subjects born within the realm, people born in England and Scotland, and all the due subordination to the august body of Parliament of Great Britain. So they say that, hey, we don't have really a quarrel with being governed by Parliament or the king, but the key word here is due subordination. So they have a problem with Parliament. Then they say, 2, His Majesty's subjects in these colonies are entitled to all the inherent rights and liberties of the natural-born subjects within the Kingdom of Great Britain. 3, that is essential to the freedom of a people. So by the way, 2, they're asserting that we have rights, just like people in England do. 3, that it is inseparably essential to the freedom of the people and the undoubted rights of Englishmen that no taxes be imposed on them but by their own consent, given personally or by their representatives. And then we get to the crux of the matter. 4, that the people of these colonies are not, and from their local circumstances cannot be, represented in the House of Commons of Great Britain because they don't vote for anyone in the House of Commons. And then 5, that the only representatives of the people of these colonies are persons chosen therein by themselves, and that no taxes ever have been or can be constitutionally imposed on them but by their respective legislatures. So in the Stamp Act Congress, you see 10 years before the Revolution coming. The people in the Stamp Act Congress say, we're very loyal Englishmen, and we are subjects of the king, and we obey Parliament in its proper sphere, but we can only be taxed by our own representatives in our colonies, not by Parliament. Parliament can impose customs duties, we have no problem with that, but we can only be taxed by ourselves. That's the American Revolution already in 1765, and everything that happens after that is just kind of restating the case and a kind of escalation toward revolutionary ideas, revolutionary action. So the Stamp Act causes a huge controversy in America. Here's a Pennsylvania newspaper that closes itself rather than submit to the stamp, expiring in hopes of a resurrection to life again. Here is a Stamp Act agent in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, being run out of town and attacked. I guess that's an effigy they're attacking, but there were people who were tarred and feathered, and they've got a coffin they're carrying as a not so subtle hint that this guy shouldn't try to collect the stamp tax. Here is a threat by a group called the Sons of Liberty that forms in Massachusetts. Pro Patria, that's Latin for patriotism, for the fatherland. So patriotic, we're patriots in other words. The first man that either distributes or makes use of stamps and paper, let him take care of his house, person, and effects. In the Vox Populi, the voice of the people. Here are protests and riots against the Stamp Act, and now we can really see the 13 American colonies for the first time acting as a unit. None of them like the Stamp Act, and they're all agreed that the Stamp Act is a bad thing. So all up and down the East Coast, from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, all the way down to Savannah, Georgia, there are Stamp Act protests. And in Boston, where the Sons of Liberty were, they're particularly violent. Well, Parliament responds by repealing the Stamp Act, and everybody's happy. And here is a mock funeral in New York for the Stamp Act. You can see the tiny little coffin that they're going to bury the Stamp Act in, and they're pretending to be sad. So this big celebration. The Stamp Act is repealed, and business is prospering, as you can see in the background once again. But all is not well. Oops. Got to zip through my slides again. Something happened. Oh, we're out of slides. So I'll continue in a moment.